Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The winter days were long and lonely in the Tennessee hills, but the nights were even longer. Matt lived on a remote farm in a deep valley surrounded by mountains that hunched up against the sky. One night, he sat around the fireplace with his father and Jeb Adams, a neighbor who had come to visit. His mother and Mrs. Adams were busy chatting in another room. "It's that time again," Jeb said, "when the Werecat starts to prowl." Matt turned his eyes from the fire to stare at Jeb's face and then his father's. He saw that his father had raised his eyebrows at Jeb as a signal to be quiet. "The boy should know," Jeb said, "especially with you and his mother going off to the state capitol next week. He should know about the Werecat." Just then, Matt's mother came into the room with Mrs. Adams, who measured Matt up and down with her sharp green eyes. "Time to go home," she announced. "We'll be back soon enough to pick up Matt when you take your trip to the Capitol." As soon as the Adams left, Matt followed his father outside to the stable. He had to feed the new colt his father had given him, and he also wanted to hear about the Werecat. "Your mother doesn't want you to know about this boy," his father said. "But maybe Jeb's right. The witch has been prowling around these hills for over 20 years. I say prowling because she changes shape from woman into a big, black cat. Not a natural-sized cat, mind you, but a big black cat the size of a hunting dog. People who've seen the witch say her eyes glow yellow in the night and her teeth are like fangs. The Werecat kills livestock, even horses." Matt's father stopped when he saw Matt staring down at the small colt. "We'll only be gone 2 days," he said. "Don't you let Mr. Adams get you worried." On the day his parents left, Mrs. Adams came to the house without Jeb. She told Matt that her husband was too busy with the livestock to come over and get him. They decided she would stay the night with Matt at his house instead. Matt didn't like the idea, but since his parents were already on their way, he couldn't do anything about it. He spent the day doing his chores, and that night he sat around the fire with Mrs. Adams. For a March night, it had gotten very cold with a gusty wind whipping around the sides of the house. "Hear about the Werecat?" Mrs. Adams said. "It's prowling round again." "Where?" Matt asked, hoping his voice wasn't shaking. "On the other side of Pepper Hill last night," Mrs. Adams said. "It killed a calf." Matt shivered and pulled his wool sweater tighter around his neck. He thought of his little colt alone in the stable outside. Mrs. Adams suddenly yawned and stretched her arms and legs. She told Matt she was ready to turn in for the night. But he thought she didn't look tired at all. Her eyes were bright and shiny. Still, he got ready to go to bed. She watched as he climbed the flight of wooden steps up to the loft bedroom. Then he heard her close the door to his parents' bedroom where she was going to sleep. Matt couldn't rest no matter how many sheep he counted. The wind was whining and moaning now, and the glass rattled in the window panes. Then a sound came out of the night that made his blood run cold. It was the meow of a cat, but it was so loud that Matt heard it over the moaning of the wind. The meowing kept on and on, moving around the outside of the house. Matt raised himself up on his trembling elbows and turned his head toward the small window that looked out over the barnyard. It was there in the moonlight, the shadowy shape of a huge black cat. Matt watched as it slowly raised its head toward the second story of the house where he lay. He saw its yellow eyes glowing in the moonlight. Then, as Matt watched, the witch cat turned away and began to stalk toward the stable. Matt knew what the witch cat was after. It wanted his colt. He jumped up and pulled on his clothes and boots. He scrambled down the steps and called out Mrs. Adams' name, but there was no answer. Just then, Matt heard a terrible screech from the witch cat, closer now to the colt's stable. He pulled on a jacket and reached for the big hunting knife that his father kept in the hallway. Grabbing it tightly, he pulled open the door. The March wind cut into his face as Matt rushed across the barnyard toward the stable. As he drew closer, he saw the stable door was standing wide open. He swallowed the lump of fear that had risen in his throat and crept inside. The moonlight was shining down through a window into the colt's pen, where the poor animal was cowering in a corner. In front of it was the giant witch cat, its long, sharp fangs glistening as it snarled at the colt. Just as the witch cat leapt forward, Matt lunged at it with his hunting knife. The knife sliced down on its right front paw. Blood spurted out. Matt jumped back as the witch cat screamed in pain. Then he looked down and saw the pool of blood on the stable floor. Matt watched as the witch cat limped out of the stable, hissing and snarling. When it was gone, he stooped down to pet his colt. Seeing the blood nearby, he kicked straw over it in disgust. Suddenly, Matt began to shake with cold and fear. He wanted to be back inside the house, safe and warm. He pulled shut the stable door and bolted it. Then he ran through the shadows of the barnyard into the house. He remembered as he closed the kitchen door that he had left the hunting knife in the stable. A strange sound came from near the fireplace. Matt raised his eyes to see Mrs. Adams sitting in front of the leaping flames. The sound he heard was a weird hissing coming from her mouth. Her eyes seemed to be glowing yellow in the firelight. And then Matt noticed her right hand, which was slowly dripping blood onto the farmhouse floor. Henry Archer woke with a start, feeling as though he were coming out of a long nightmare. He remembered that he had been sick for weeks, deathly sick. He remembered the doctor standing over his bed and shaking his head as though there were no hope. The faces of his nephews were there too, their glittering eyes staring down on his weak body. At the time, Henry's confused thoughts had cleared enough to realize that they wanted him to die, wanted him dead so they could inherit all of his money. Now Henry was feeling better than he had during all those long weeks of illness. The only problem he seemed to be having was a certain shortness of breath, and the night was so dark, and his bed unusually hard. Henry shifted his body, feeling how stiff and cold it seemed. Then he raised his hands, which were crossed over his chest, to stretch them. To his surprise, he hit a hard wooden board only several inches above his body. At first, Henry thought he must still be asleep and dreaming. He knew of no place like this that he'd ever been before. His hands groped around to feel what kind of place it was. The more he examined it, the more he came to realize that he was in some sort of wooden box. The air was suddenly heavier around him than before. Henry's mind raced through the possibilities. He could think of no other reason why he might be in a wooden box than if it were a coffin. Through the panic creeping into his brain, Henry remembered that if he were in a coffin, he would be dressed in his best clothes, not the night clothes of a sick man. With a sinking heart, he passed his hand over the smooth silk tie lying on his chest, with his big diamond stick pin fastened through it. He remembered what he had written in his will. that he be buried with his diamond stickpin. Buried alive! Henry's mind sank into horror. The doctor must have thought him dead and buried him alive. Though he was not dead, he surely would be in a few more hours. Henry pushed up his knees against the coffin lid, but it didn't budge. He thought of the 6 feet of earth piled on top of him. Nothing he could do would move that weight. A scream of despair rose in Henry's throat and echoed off the walls of the coffin. He didn't know how he could endure the slow, horrible death that awaited him. And then, through the thoughts that tortured him, came a sound of something moving above him. It scratched against the dirt with sharp, steady movements. Every muscle in Henry's body tensed. What could be working through the ground of a graveyard with such persistence? Henry thought of those horrible tales about graveyard rats. People said they got bigger than cats. They dug down to freshly buried coffins, then they chewed through the wood to get to the corpse inside. Henry shook with fear as the digging sound above him came closer and closer. He felt the air in the coffin become thicker and hotter. Now he had to face the choice of 2 terrible deaths. Suddenly, there was a dull scratch against the top of his coffin lid. Henry imagined how big a rat must be to make that sound. He tried to push up against the lid, but it was fastened tight. He would have to lie there, like a helpless victim, until the rats had gnawed through the lid. There was more scratching against the lid. Then, out of the darkness above him, Henry heard a muffled voice.
"Almost got it now,"
the voice said.
"All that's left is taking off the lid,"
said a second voice. Henry's body froze in shock. It wasn't rats that were after his body. It was grave robbers. He heard a crowbar being wedged under the coffin lid. Then, with a creak, it started to raise.
"You get the diamond stick pin,"
the first voice said.
"Uncle Henry paid thousands for it. It must be worth a fortune." "No use letting it sit on a corpse,"
said the second voice. Just then, the 2 young men pulled off the lid and stared down at the corpse of their uncle. And as their greedy hands reached down to grab for his stick pin, Henry Archer rose out of his coffin and pulled them down into the grave. And he left them there, screaming with terror, as he walked back to town, brushing off the dirt that had fallen onto his diamond stick pin.